Good morning. Welcome to Cool Springs. Today is Sunday, November the 2nd, 2025. And so, since the clocks changed last night or early this morning, depending upon when you chose to set your clocks, it is the end of daylight savings time. So, if you're watching this live, that means that you were one of the ones who remembered to change your clocks. If you turn into it later, oh well. The good news is that you can see it still on the YouTube page. We have enough people here at the church so far this morning that the pastor is relieved because he won't be preaching to an empty sanctuary. We're a small church, and so numbers are not big, but people apparently in our neck of the woods did remember to change their clocks. Because it's November, we're going to be doing a new topic for the month of November, so I'm going to have camera operator turn the camera to the board for a minute, and we'll give a brief outline of where we're going to be this month, just so you can read ahead. Today, November 2nd, our theme for the whole month will be giving thanks, and today we're going to be looking at kind of an interesting person that you wouldn't normally think of when you think about giving thanks. We're going to be looking at Nebuchadnezzar. After God had to really get his attention, but Nebuchadnezzar realizes finally that the God that Daniel has been worshiping and that Daniel's friends have been worshiping really is God. So today we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 4. Next week we're going to look at Psalm 118, verse 31, and the 119th Psalm, because we're going to be looking in our Giving Thanks series at the fact that God's love endures forever. Then on the 16th, we're going to look at the 10 lepers that Jesus healed, only one of whom was willing to come back and just simply say, thank you. And then on the 23rd, we're going to look at Jesus giving thanks for food out of Matthew chapter 15. Jesus fed crowds twice. He fed a crowd of 5,000 in one story. He fed a crowd of 4,000 in another story. And then when we look at all four gospel accounts, the night before he goes to the cross, he is celebrating the holiday of Passover. And the Passover involves giving thanks to God, praises to God, and commemorating what God has done and what God is about to do. Because you see, on both occasions, when the original Passover was happening and when Jesus was in that upper room celebrating an annual holiday, just like this month, everybody in America will celebrate an annual holiday dedicated to giving thanks. In the case of the Exodus, the people were to stay in their homes, consume that Passover lamb, be ready to move out, but stay there all night because they were thankful for the fact that God had said that the death angel would pass over any home that had the blood of the lamb on the door. But if the house wasn't covered by the blood of the lamb, then the firstborn of both people and animals was going to die. It was God sparing his people as he brought down judgment on those who were not his people. And then in the upper room, as Jesus and his disciples are remembering that event from thousands of years before, Jesus tells them there's another meaning and it's about to happen. Because as he takes the bread and he takes the cup and he hands it out to his disciples, he tells them, this bread is my body, which is broken for you. It was going to happen in a matter of hours. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. I won't drink again of it until I drink of it anew with all of you in the kingdom of heaven. And so we need to look at giving thanks not only for food, but for God's enduring love and his provision for us. And then on the 30th of November, we're going to look at, and I deliberately don't have a scripture put up here because we're going to go a lot of places in scripture, being thankful no matter what. Now we set these studies up like a year ago. We put out a schedule for the people in our church and for the camera operators to know how to set up the YouTube page with the header and all the things that they need. When we set this up last November, we didn't have a clue that by this November, so many people in our own area would be starting to really feel the pangs of a federal government shutdown that's got our soldiers working but not being paid, our civilians, some of whom have been laid off, some of whom are working again without pay, and how it's affecting every business in the community, and how a lot of people are coming together to offer ways to provide help, letting people know where there are extra food banks and blessing boxes scattered around town, businesses that are offering people the chance to come in and get free meals if they need them, charities that are certainly stepping up. It's a time where right now, in this community and in many others around the country, people are learning to be thankful no matter what, and for neighbors to be looking out for neighbors. And that's part of what we need to do as believers in Christ. When the New Testament is being written and the disciples are out there now sharing the word and calling people to faith in Jesus Christ, everybody they start to call to Christ eventually comes under persecution. The Jews who turn into believers in Jesus come under persecution first from the Jewish religious establishment, and then ultimately from Rome. They get shunned by their neighbors. They face torture. They face death. They were being called to serve God, and at the same time, being called to be faithful and thankful, no matter what. So that's what we're going to be looking at in the month of November here. And now I'll go back to the table and invite you to turn to Daniel chapter 4 in your Bibles. Daniel chapter 4 is really Nebuchadnezzar's testimony, and I want to set the scene for you just a little bit. What we already know from the book of Daniel is that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom has been growing in world power and influence for a while. The Babylonian kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar's in charge of has already conquered the Assyrian Empire, which was the previous world power, and they've conquered all of Syria and what was that northern kingdom of Israel that had been swallowed up by Assyria. Now they've also conquered Judah, the southern kingdom, and they've carried off a bunch of people into captivity. And they've conquered a good portion of Egypt. And what portion of Egypt they haven't conquered, Egypt is being careful not to mess with Nebuchadnezzar and tick him off, because they don't want to be in trouble themselves. So Nebuchadnezzar's got this world kingdom that stretches from what you and I would know as Iraq to parts of what you and I would know today as Egypt. That is a massive world empire. So he's got a lot of reason to be proud of himself and proud of his people. And he's got a lot of reason to think that those pagan false gods that he's worshiping are real and powerful. Because after all, he's conquering other people. It's a case of my God's bigger than your God, just like kids on a playground in elementary school age, my dad or my big brother can beat up yours. It's that kind of mentality, but on an adult level. Then one night Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that troubled him. And the next day he's telling his advisors, people he's put into positions in his government, but somehow he knows these people are just telling him what he wants to hear and blowing sunshine up his skirt, so to speak. He tells him, I had this terrible dream, and I want to know what it means. But you see, down deep inside, he doesn't even trust his own advisors. So he's decided on this occasion, I'm going to put him to a test to find out just how much these people really are as far as being wise men and counselors. He tells them, I want you to tell me what I dreamed, and then I'll believe your interpretation of the dream. But if you can't tell me what I dreamed, then I know you're just trying to trick me and deceive me and lie to me, and I'm going to have you all put to death. And obviously, the advisors are in shock. Nobody has ever asked this before. No reasonable person would. But yet their boss just told them that. And he does have the power of life and death over them. Well, it doesn't do you any good. If you ever find yourself in this kind of situation, whether it's with a family member, a next door neighbor, a government official, a supervisor, whoever it is, you're not going to do yourself any favor by telling an unreasonable person that they're being unreasonable. It's just going to make them more unreasonable, more angry, more full of themselves. It's just going to spin them up even more. But yet that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar's wise men do. They tell him that no reasonable person would ever ask this. You tell us what you dreamed and we'll be happy to give you the interpretation. Well, now he's hot under the collar. And so he repeats the demand. No, you're lying to me. If you can't tell me what I dreamed, how am I supposed to trust your interpretation of the dream? You either tell me now or I'm going to have you put to death on the spot. Talk about pressure. So, of course, they can't do it. King issues the order to the chief of his bodyguard. Now, that guy's got to carry out orders, because what will happen to him if he doesn't carry out the order? You'll be one of the ones on the receiving end of Nebuchadnezzar's wrath. So he's been told, go round them all up and put them all to death. And the servant, Arioch by name, comes knocking on the doors of Daniel and his friends. They're in year number 2 of their 3-year college program to be retrained from everything that they knew as Jewish young men back in their home country before their country was overrun and they were carried off into exile as slaves of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian Empire. They're being retrained, reprogrammed to turn into little Babylonians because Nebuchadnezzar wants to use them to control the rest of the Jewish population. And when Arioch tells Daniel why he's there, Daniel asked him to do something extraordinary. Delay doing the king's orders. Give me an opportunity to pray with my friends, and I'll go to the king and interpret his dreams because my God will reveal it to me. Arioch has a choice to make. 99.9999999% of the world would make the choice, I can listen to this kid in year number 2 of his college prep program, or I can listen to the king who can have me put to death. Which way do you think the scales are going to go? Heavily in Nebuchadnezzar's favor. But you see, Arioch's had a little bit of experience with Daniel already, because it's year 2 of Daniel's program. And in year 1, when they were first brought into the king's training program, they were offered the rich food from the king's table, but it wasn't healthy food. It wasn't kosher food. It was food that had been sacrificed to other idols, and it included a large amount of alcoholic beverage. And Daniel and his friends said no. We know it's not right for us to eat that because that meat's been sacrificed to idols. We know that food is not healthy. We're going to honor God with our bodies. And so they had asked Arioch last year, put us to the test. Give us just vegetables and water for 10 days, and then see how we look compared to the other guys. And then you do what seems right to you. Arioch was willing to do that little test. And sure enough, at the end of 10 days, Daniel and his buddies did look better. So he continued to allow them to have the veggies and the water, and they continued to look better, be healthier, and do well in their studies because their minds aren't buzzed. And they're not putting lots of fatty foods and things that would cause you to be sluggish in their body. So he's had a little bit of experience. But he hadn't had a whole lot, just a little bit of experience. He was willing to let Daniel and his buddies do the test for 10 days. But here's what Arioch didn't even know, is that, yeah, they've politely asked you for permission to eat the veggies and waters for 10 days, just, Arioch, so you can see how we look. But they'd already made up their minds. When you look at Daniel chapter 1, and it says Daniel determined in his heart, the way it really reads is Daniel sat on his heart. At the end of those 10 days, if Arioch had said, okay, you've had your fun, yeah, you do look better, but I can't risk having the king ask me why you aren't eating the food he assigned to you, and you're just going to have to go through and go along with everybody else. If Arioch had said that, what Daniel and his 3 friends were going to do was refuse to eat it all. They had determined in their heart, we will honor God above all else, even if it means we die of starvation. Fortunately for everybody concerned, Daniel and his friends are still around in year number 2, because Arioch didn't say, okay, it's too risky. Even though I see the evidence that you are healthier, I'm just going to have to insist. He's let them continue to eat the veggies. They're still there. They're healthier. They're stronger. And so Arioch is willing to give Daniel just a little bit of time. And Daniel and his friends do what God's people should do, particularly when you get into a case where we are going to be looking at the end of this month at being thankful to God and being faithful to God no matter what happens to you. And so Daniel and his friends pray about it. He goes to the king the next morning. Arioch is really risking a lot by just carrying Daniel to the king. Nebuchadnezzar's a hothead. What do you mean you didn't kill him on the spot? Well, sir, he says he can tell you what your dream is. You see, that's going to get Nebuchadnezzar's interest. Daniel does interpret the dream, because chapter 2 is that famous world prophecy that God was giving Nebuchadnezzar even in his pagan state. Nebuchadnezzar, you saw this statue with a head of gold, the breastplate and arms of silver, a belly of bronze, legs of iron, and feet and toes of iron mixed with clay. And Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. He's been told what it means. He's been told what the dream is and what it means. A great gift from God, and he's been told, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. That's like saying, you're the winner. You're the champion. Last night happened to be Game 7 of the World Series, and 2 teams, one from the American League, one from the National League, were battling it out, and the team that went ahead at first and was ahead for most of the game didn't wind up ultimately being the victor. The game went into extra innings, and the team that had been behind scored just enough to get it to extra innings, and then scored in extra innings, and they won the championship. When Nebuchadnezzar was told, you're the head of gold, that would make his already full of himself proud heart even prouder. But what he should have learned from that is, this guy can do what none of my other counselors can do. I need to pay attention to what he tells me about God, because he's given God, his God, the credit. He's not taking the praise for himself. Daniel and his buddies aren't saying, hey, look at me, I know how to interpret dreams. Hey, look at my buddies here who are supporting me in prayer. No, they're giving the credit to God. Nebuchadnezzar should have learned the lesson. And at the end of chapter 2, it kind of appears that he might have learned the lesson, but not really. Because in chapter 3 that immediately follows that, Nebuchadnezzar has then set up a 90-foot high statue of a person, solid gold. And he's ordered everybody in the kingdom, when you hear the sounds of the musical instruments playing, everybody's got to bow down and worship my statue to my God, or I'm going to have you put to death. Again, Mr. Hothead. Daniel isn't even mentioned in chapter 3. We do not know where Daniel was. Possibly, it's just speculation that Bible scholars have. Possibly he was somewhere else in the empire, because it's a huge empire, on the king's business. But we do know that Daniel's 3 prayer partner buddies, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, more commonly known by their slave names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all names that honor Nebuchadnezzar's false gods. They're around the capital city, and they're confronted with the choice that everybody else is confronted with. Bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's statue and worship the way he tells you to, worshiping his false gods, or forfeit your life. And they refused to bow down. And word got back to Nebuchadnezzar. Word got back to Nebuchadnezzar by some of those same advisors whose lives had been saved not too long ago by Daniel's God being willing to give Daniel what Nebuchadnezzar dreamed and what it meant. Those same people whose lives were spared, those wise men, those astrologers, those counselors, they weren't grateful to Daniel and his friends. They weren't grateful to Daniel's gods. Their lives had been spared on that occasion, and they're perfectly willing to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's statue. They'll do whatever it takes. They'll lie, steal, cheat, do whatever to spare their lives and maintain their position. They're real politicians. And so they rat out Daniel's friends. Nebuchadnezzar hears it and he summons them to account. What's this I hear about you? Is it true that you're refusing to bow down to my statue, which I had made to honor my gods? And of course, the young men reply, King, you should know better than to ask us this. By now, you know us. You know we worship the one true God. We can't bow down to your God. Nebuchadnezzar pushes a little bit harder. He's pushing back big time, and he's got the power of the throne and the army to back it up. I'm going to give you one more chance. And if you bow down, well and good. Yeah, well and good. Like he's not going to remember that they refused his order in the first place. You see, Nebuchadnezzar's got this problem of the heart. He's full of himself. He hasn't really learned the lesson that he should have learned from what happened back in chapter 2. And so he's pushing back at the young men, and he tells them, when you hear the sound, this is your last chance, boys. If not, I'm going to have you immediately. There won't be any time for a second chance. I'm going to have you immediately bound and tossed into the furnace, and I'm going to have the furnace stoked up 7 times hotter than it normally is. And then he asked them what he thinks is a rhetorical question. What God can save you from my orders? You ever heard the phrase, be careful what you ask for, you might get it? Nebuchadnezzar just asked one of those, be careful what you ask for, you might get it type of questions. Because he's thinking that he's that statue of gold, that he's that head of gold in the dream, that his God was more powerful than Daniel's God, that he's got all the power. Me, 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 me. And he wants what he wants when he wants it. And he doesn't want to take no for an answer. But those young men do stand their ground. You asked what God can save us from your edict? They make a very bold statement. Ours can. Ours can. You're king. You've got armies. You've got this fiery furnace. You've got thousands of people bowing and scraping to you every time you walk by. You want to know what God can spare us from your power? Ours can. But know this, king. Even if our God chooses not to spare us, we will not bow and worship your God. You see, they were willing to be thankful no matter what. Even if it meant we're going to be burnt to death in a matter of minutes. We're going to go down standing up, true to our knowledge of God, true to our faith. We will not break our covenant with God. Nebuchadnezzar, okay, have it your way. He has them bound up in all their clothes, combustible, with ropes tied so tightly around them that they can't possibly wiggle loose. He has the furnace stoked up even higher, and it's a 2-story furnace, so he's going to have some of his best troops pick these 3 rebel scum up and tote them up the staircase and drop them in to this fiery furnace that's been stoked up to 7 times its normal level of hotness. And he's there to watch because he wants to see anybody who would dare go against him burn to death in a very, very horrible fashion. A lot of times we have soldiers. My father happened to be one of thousands of Allied troops who had to go and liberate the concentration camps that Hitler had scattered all over Europe. And Dad came home with some trauma. Trauma that he tried as best as he could to shield his family from. Trauma that he was only just beginning to talk to his pastor about in the last year of his life, some 50 years after these concentration camps had been liberated. But on the few rare occasions when Dad would talk about it, he would just make very general statements. And even though I was a child and a teenager at the time, I can still see it in my mind's eye, clear as a bell. Dad saying things like, if you've ever smelled burning flesh, you'll never forget it. And then he'd change the subject because he couldn't talk about it. A lot of times our soldiers, our first responders, the firemen and the police officers who have to rescue people from burning buildings or from cars that have caught fire, and they aren't able to rescue the people, and they hear the agony of the people in the flames, and then they have to go and break the word to the families. A lot of times, those first responders, those soldiers, those police officers, they carry a lot of internal trauma and hurt. And that's a good thing, because it means that they care, that they have a soul, that they aren't so hardened by human suffering that they can just blow it off or forget about it after a day or two. That the fact that they carry scars means that there's humanity in there. You see, that was part of the problem with those Nazi war criminals. Day after day after day, they were responsible for brutalizing people, for mass slaughter of people. They didn't care. They were able to go home at night and be with their families and eat and sleep and drink and carry on and celebrate holidays and not have 1 minute's moral conscience about what they were doing. Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 3, and there's a reason why we're doing this long setup. You really need to know the story in order to know the testimony that's going to come afterwards. Nebuchadnezzar's there with his advisors, and he's watching gleefully as Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael are tossed into that furnace. The fire produces enough heat to where the soldiers and guards who drop them in actually die from overheating themselves. And the young men are dropped into this blazing furnace that's normally used for foraging tools. And instead of hearing dying screams, and instead of hearing pleas for mercy, Nebuchadnezzar can see through the open door for some of the heat and flames to get out. He sees something he wasn't expecting to see. Not one, not two, not three, but 4 men walking around in the flames, totally unharmed. And he can't believe what he's seeing. So he turns to his yes men, those counselors, those wise men, the ones who ratted out Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. Didn't we put 3 men into the furnace? And because they're the classic yes men, oh yes sir, yes sir. But I see 4. And one of them appears to be like a son of the gods. He's seeing Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael being rescued by their God. They don't run out of the open door of that furnace. They stay in there. They're perfectly comfortable in the flames, through the flames, because they're not harmed, because they're in the presence of their God. They don't come out until Nebuchadnezzar calls for them to come out. And when he calls for them to come out, they come out. 3 of them. And they're not singed. Their clothes aren't scorched. They're perfectly fine. They don't even smell like they've been in a fire. You'd think it would get his attention. But apparently some people are hard nuts to crack. And that gets us to chapter 4. All that we've just talked about, that we've taken up half of this Sunday school hour for, is for you to see the progression in what's going on, not only in Nebuchadnezzar's life, but in the lives of Daniel and his friends and those advisors and all the people who are around Nebuchadnezzar's court. They're being given opportunities to see God in action, to see people who are actually following God, to see people who are risking it all, at least in earthly terms, for their deeply held faith in God. And now we're in chapter 4, and all this has happened and some time has passed. And chapter 4 opens up with Nebuchadnezzar the king to all the peoples, plural, because he's in charge of a vast empire. To all of the peoples, nations, he's conquered many nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth. He's testifying to his own kingdom, but also to the outside world. There are some parts of the world that he hasn't conquered, that he's got emissaries that go to these other places. He's testifying to the entire world. Because you see, chapter 4 is Nebuchadnezzar giving his own testimony after the fact that something else has happened to him that's finally cracked that hard shell of his heart and his mind. May your peace abound. It seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God, and you should notice in your Bibles, Most High God, those words are capitalized, because that in Hebrew is El Elyon, a title for the Most High God, the everlasting God. It seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, How mighty are his wonders! His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. This is Nebuchadnezzar reflecting back much later, praising God, being thankful to God for what God's done for him. Not just for the fact that God showed him through Daniel about that dream back in chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar learned that his empire was the head of gold and that the other empires that were going to follow would be lesser in value than his. Not just the God who rescued Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael from Nebuchadnezzar's reckless, foolish, arrogant, throw them into the furnace for refusing to bow to my pagan ways. He's just given thanks to God. And if you look real closely at what Nebuchadnezzar's just said here, those words should sound kind of familiar to you, particularly if you spend more time in your New Testament than your Old, because your New Testament is built on the foundation of the Old. When Jesus' disciples come to him and ask him, Lord, we want to pray like you do. Teach us how to pray. And Jesus gives them that model prayer that you and I know is either the Lord's Prayer or, depending on your denomination, you may call it the Our Father. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Doesn't it have a familiar ring to it here? Because Jesus is familiar with Daniel's recording of Nebuchadnezzar's prayer when Nebuchadnezzar finally had his come to God type of moment. Nebuchadnezzar's just delivered this marvelous praise to his kingdom and to the world. He's no longer saying, me, 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 me. He's saying, praise God, the Most High God, the everlasting God, the God who's mighty and wonderful, the God whose kingdom is everlasting. Nebuchadnezzar's a changed man here. Now he's going to tell you why. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream, and it made me fearful. And these fantasies, as I lay on my bed, and the visions in my mind, kept alarming me. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners came in, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to me. He's now telling us what happened since chapter 3. I had this other dream. And history's repeating itself. I had this dream and it alarmed me. He had a dream that alarmed him in chapter 2. And his demand back then was, conjurers, tell me what my dream is. He didn't ask that this time. He tells them the dream. Now tell me what it means. But they can't. You see, he's gone into the old habit of still relying on those pagan false gods. The pagan false gods that they all worshiped, that couldn't tell him what the dream was in chapter 2. That allowed them to go along with his foolish, everybody bow down and worship this statue that you had made out of human hands in chapter 3, where you threw Daniel's 3 friends into the furnace because they wouldn't bow to your God. And they even told you, in answer to your question, what God can save you from me, ours can. And then God showed up and did just exactly that. Now he's doing the same old thing. What's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Nebuchadnezzar's doing the same thing over and over again. Conjurers, the guys I didn't trust back in chapter 2, The guys who ratted out Daniel's buddies in chapter 3. Now in chapter 4, I've had another disturbing dream, and now I'm going to trust you again? But they couldn't do it. But finally, Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. And notice there, when it says that in verses 8 and 9, Daniel, whose name according to my God was Belteshazzar. My God is little g. See, Nebuchadnezzar's clinging to old habits and old ways. He doesn't want to let go and let God. He's like a lot of us. Doesn't want to let go and let God. I'm acknowledging Daniel, whose name means God is my judge, but I'm going to call him by Belteshazzar, one of my pagan gods, many pagan gods. Belteshazzar means Bel is God. Bel hadn't done anything for Nebuchadnezzar, ever. But he's still clinging to Daniel. Sometimes I'm going to call you Daniel, sometimes I'm going to call you Belteshazzar. My God, little g. And in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. Nebuchadnezzar's a little confused. He's sort of willing to acknowledge, after all this that's gone on, after all he's experienced, that that God that those Jewish boys, Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael, all worship, maybe he is a God among the gods. He's not willing to acknowledge that there's only one, and that it's not anybody he's been worshiping up until this point. I related the dream to him, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods, little g, is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream which I've seen along with its interpretation. Now these were the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed. And for time's sake, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, he's going to relate this vision of this tree that's huge, that has enormous branches, that seems to cover the whole earth, that it provides shade and a resting place for all kinds of animals, and that he hears this voice saying, cut it down but leave a stump, and the tree gets cut down, and there's this stump, and after a period of time, a little sprout starts to grow up among it. He knows what the dream is. He's told his magicians, he's told Daniel, and now he's telling his audience, here's what I dreamed back then. Daniel, tell me what it means. And Daniel is appalled. Daniel cares about Nebuchadnezzar, even though Nebuchadnezzar, up until this point, has been very selfish, very full of himself. He's been a bully to his own staff, let alone to the peoples he's conquered. Nebuchadnezzar is a jerk. And that's really not a strong enough word to describe Nebuchadnezzar. But Daniel cares about him as a human being, and Daniel's response to him is, "O king, I wish this dream was about anybody but you." And he tells him rightly, here's what's going to happen. Nebuchadnezzar, because you've been arrogant, because you've refused to truly acknowledge the one true God, because you continue to hang on to these false gods, Nebuchadnezzar, God's going to take your kingdom away from you for a time until you come to your senses and finally realize who God is. And sure enough, that's what's going to happen. Nebuchadnezzar's going to go on to give his testimony throughout chapter 4. And I'm going to pick up the reading now with verse number 28. All this happened to Nebuchadnezzar, the king. 12 months later, he had that dream. He told everybody what the dream was. His magicians, his conjurers, his worshipers of those false gods, they couldn't tell him what it meant. But once again, Daniel could. And Nebuchadnezzar listened to it, sort of. He heard it in one ear. But he didn't do anything about it. He kept on doing it his way. And 1 year later, because now we're in verse 28, all this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king reflected and said, and in this next phrase, I actually want you to take the time when you're looking at this to count up in your mind, on your fingers, the number of personal pronouns that Nebuchadnezzar, the proud, arrogant king of the empire, uses. Because it's proof positive that his heart has not yet changed. That God is going to get his attention in the only way that's going to seem to work. You'd like to lead the horse to water and let the horse drink it, but sometimes you have to drag the horse to water, and sometimes you may have to shove the horse's head into the water to get him to realize, oh, water, I might need this. Nebuchadnezzar's going to be that kind of a stubborn mule of a man. The king reflected and said, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty? Me, 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 me. While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You'll be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High, there's that El Elyon again, and Most High is capitalized, until you realize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows on it whomever he wishes. Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was filled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, and his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. But, another one of those big buts of the Bible, at the end of that period, 7 years later, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, El Elyon again, and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. All the inhabitants of the earth, including Nebuchadnezzar himself. But he, God, does according to his will in the host of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom, and my counselors and nobles began seeking me out, so I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now, remember, this is a testimony. He's telling what happened before. He's saying, basically, this is how I shook my fist at God. And God showed up and got my attention. For 7 years, I was literally barking mad, howling at the moon, living out with the animals. He had gone mad. And at the end of 7 years, God allowed him to get his sanity back. And when he got his sanity back, he realized, finally, everything that's been going on for years. And now he's willing to acknowledge God. This is the king of the Babylonian Empire, testifying to the entire world. God had to show me who was really in charge. And it wasn't me. God had to show me that he was bigger and mightier and more powerful, that he can give me the kingdom or he can take it away. Nebuchadnezzar is finally bowing the knee to God and praising him and acknowledging him. Now, verse 37. Now, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. What's he doing? He's giving thanks to God. I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. Well, who's been walking in pride in the Babylonian kingdom? Not Arioch, who was afraid of losing his head but was willing to give a 10-day test to the boys in the college program to let them eat veggies and drink water. Not all those counselors and conjurers and wise men and sorcerers who were telling Nebuchadnezzar what they thought he wanted to hear and doing whatever he said, regardless of how stupid it was, just to spare their heads. Who's been walking around proud and arrogant? Nebuchadnezzar himself. But he's finally learned that there is a God and it's not him. He's finally bowing the knee and worshiping and giving thanks to the God who had to punish him, who had to straighten him out, who had to give him a giant timeout in order to get his attention. But God so loved the world that he was willing to reach out to a Nebuchadnezzar. And the good news for you and me as we're contemplating this season of giving thanks is that, no, we're not a Nebuchadnezzar. We're not some of those Nazis who followed the orders of an evil government leader who told them to brutalize people and slaughter innocent people. We're not that level of wicked. But you know what? We're sinners separated from God. And we need God's mercy and grace, just like those concentration camp guards and collaborators and commandants needed to turn from their wicked ways and admit that they were sinners and admit that they needed God and to give praise and thanks to the God who so loved the world that he came down and took on flesh and paid our sin penalty for us so that we could be restored to a relationship with him. Next week, we're going to look, like I said, at Psalms 118, starting in verse 31, and the 119th Psalm, the longest chapter in the Bible. And there's a reason why we want to look specifically at that long one, because it's a love story of how God's love for us endures forever. The question is, are we thankful enough to love God back? See you next week. Thanks for watching.